little bit difficult because we have to do it all, we have to do it urgently, because we're starting on a journey to a 2030 emissions reduction target in 2022, which is leaving it insanely late, but we have no choice. The best time to do this was 20 years ago. The second best time to start is the election of a new government, because there wasn't a proper framework for serious emissions reduction until 2030, which is now 87 months away. 87 months is not long for a massive transformation in our economy. And in terms of what we need to do, the transition to renewables has been too slow and too disorderly. We've had coal-fired power leave the system without new renewables coming on in anywhere near enough quantity. Over the last 10 years, 4 gigawatts of supply left our energy system and 1 gigawatt of supply came on. No wonder we were faced with an energy crisis just a month or so ago. That's the problem. We need more renewables to reduce emissions, but we need more renewables to replace coal-fired power. Because the coal-fired power stations are reaching the end of natural life, they're closing, that is inevitable, they'll continue to close, and we have not had a properly organised transition. We need to be doing it all in all sectors. So as well as the climate bill passing the Senate today, the electric vehicle tax cut will pass the House today. The opposition is opposing the electric vehicle tax cut. I mean, that's a sort of, frankly, I don't mean to be too partisan, but that's the world we're now in. They're opposing a tax cut for electric vehicles. That's just part of the transport transition. We're going to have an EV or a transport consultation paper out in the next few weeks about getting better access to no emissions and low emissions vehicle for Australia, because we're the only developed country apart from Russia without fuel efficiency standards. We want to have a conversation about fixing that. We're cutting the taxes on EVs. Safeguards mechanism may come up. That's how we get emissions down in our biggest emitters. We're not going to reduce emissions as a country unless we reduce emissions from our biggest emitters. Statement of fact. There's been no policy framework to do it. Safeguards is the mechanism to fix that.
We prefer to see a moratorium on new coal and gas projects and a regulated phase out of existing ones so that workers and communities have certainty. But we understand that's not the government's approach. They've got this instead. But we'll take, I guess, a principled approach to assessing it. It's got to have real cuts to pollution, so not just hot air, it's got to be real cuts to pollution, and it's got to deal with this question of new coal and gas, which for us is the critical one, and perhaps we can talk a bit about that in a moment, and it's got to be a scheme that has integrity. And so the question is, again, what is if the government wants to adopt Tony Abbott's architecture, what is it actually going to look like? Will it actually stop pollution from going up? Will that be built into the scheme? Because it's not, as we read it, an essential feature of the scheme, and that's a problem. So one of the big challenges that we've got, and this is one of the things that we're going to be pushing hard on, is saying, well, look, we can have a discussion during the course of this parliament about how to deal with existing projects and how we transition out of them. But one of the things we all should be able to agree on is don't make the problem worse while we're trying to fix it. So don't open up new projects. And I think that is because if we do, it's going to put an additional, not only is it going to put the climate challenge further out of reach, it's actually going to put an additional burden on other sectors of the economy, because they're going to be asked to do more to make way for these big new coal, oil and gas projects that are unnecessary. And according to the International Energy Agency, if you're to meet net zero goals, we can't be opening up these new projects. The other things I would say is that we pushed strongly before the election for the creation of legislated transition authorities around the country so that we can actually have a managed transition, because for a lot of, and the Minister talked a bit about this, about what is the jobs future in these communities, a lot of the jobs might not be in energy, right? They might be in manufacturing, they might be in the service sector, but they might actually be in other forms of mining.
And it's going to require a massive collaboration, not just CSIRO, but all the universities, all of the sectors, all of the industries and all governments at every level need to do what we did during COVID. We need to collaborate at a mission-like scale to deliver these things. But if we're willing to back ourselves, we have a plan to do it.
We know we have to electrify everything. We know we have to replace the machinery and infrastructure of the economy, and we know we have to shift our approach to land use. And I think there's broad agreement that we have, in many cases, the technological capability to be able to stare into that. Maybe not quite to get to net negative at this juncture, but certainly to be able to start paying attention to what are companies and businesses and governments going to do to start planning what those transition plans are, putting in place what the actual strategies are, and then identifying what those financing requirements are and the technologies that need to go there. So I'm hopeful we have the language and beginning to have the technology. We certainly see a lot of that, but it is urgent, and we probably need to be moving quite a bit faster than we are.
Well, I think we need a holistic view of this. There's the domestic aspect of it, and to get people to make the transition, and we will go to electrified vehicles. There is no doubt about that in my mind. It's just a question of what is the trajectory and how do we bring consumers right around this country on that pathway, because the motor vehicle still is very much the dominant form of transport in this country. So I think what you need is to have a holistic solution domestically. That means you need to have an electricity network that can support it. You need recharging infrastructure that provides people who buy these vehicles with certainty that they can live with them. Now, that's especially important in regional and rural Australia, and I think it's especially important on the road system, on the highways in particular, because that's where I think Australians who move to EVs, when we go in volume, because we've probably only got about 50,000 of them on the roads today, but what happens when there's 5 million of them? What happens on Good Friday when you pull into the service station and you're fourth in the queue? They, on the highway somewhere, these are the big issues. So they have the recharging infrastructure, and we need reliability of that infrastructure as well. And then internationally, we must link ourselves, because we are a 1 million vehicle market in this country. The world market is 100 million.
We published a seminal piece of work called the Australian National Outlook. Now, it got published in Nature because it's the first time in the world that science has been used to map an economic future for a country. So not theory, science. And in the best case of that economic future, we mapped a pathway, right in the back of the report is a pathway to net zero by 2050, with a roughly 40% emissions reduction by 2030. And it's largely the plan that the government has adopted moving forward, which is great because it's based in science. But it requires us to invent some things to get there. And Sally mentioned it. We've got some gaps around land use, around negative emissions technologies. About 40% of the things we need to get to net zero have to be invented. But this country has the power to invent those things. So a plan and a willingness to back ourselves. And if you think it's hard, you're right. But think of this. Australia has the longest grid in the world. It's arguably one of the most challenging grids in the world to shift to renewables, and yet we are leading the world in the penetration of solar.
Both in the short term and the long term. So in the short term, we need to start creating the incentives, sort of support for market development that gets those things moving. So that's on the technology front. I would really focus on the stuff that we can do now, and then that mature but not yet commercially viable stuff that we need. And that can deal with, in some hard to abate sectors, about 70% of their emissions. And then if I think about places, what I'm talking about there are the concentration of communities, industries, traditional owners, the possibility to concentrate finance and investment, skills and workforce concentrations, that if we focus on our places, on our regions, and particularly industrial regions, I guess that's what I'm looking at the moment, and our cities, as a way of coordinating and collaborating, both in the short term and the long term, because I think there's a need for reassurance now, actually particularly in regional areas, that says we're allowed to talk about it, we know we need it, let's get on and do something. Industry wants to make a difference, everybody knows the grid needs to be greened, and I think that that's a scope that can be reassuring to get that positive conversation going in those jurisdictions, and it has a really long-term impact. This is where people live, this is where their kids go to school, this is where their jobs are and where they want their jobs to be. So that long-term, short-term and long-term focus on places, I think, is a really important part of this as well.
Because one of my great concerns is that we can't put all our eggs in one basket. And Bloomberg have recently come out and said that by 2030 they thought that there would be capacity for 40 million batteries to be made for EVs in the world. Now that's great news. The problem is the world vehicle market annually is 100 million sales.
And then as you shift all the way through into the incredible scientific advances, there are companies all across Australia just doing extraordinary things, from planting seagrass to synthetic whale poo to working through direct air capture where you suck the carbon out of the atmosphere, chemically bind it and kind of, push it down into the substrate. There are companies dealing into soil health and fungi, and we really do get to, in our own right, look at how we decarbonise our economy, and we spend a lot of time talking about that. But the opportunity set for us is to actually help the world decarbonise.
We should have a national CO2 target. I think the Minister, Chris Bowen, mentioned we're the only major economy in the world apart from Russia that doesn't have a CO2 target. We believe there should be a long-term CO2 target, and we should review that on a regular basis as we see where technological developments get to, where price points get to, and we should aim for a long-term target but regular reviews, and in that way hopefully we can get to the situation where we can bring the population along, because anything that you don't bring the motorist along will be ineffective.
The carbon price question, I think a carbon price makes sense. I think it's politically not palatable for now, so a lot of people have stopped talking about it because it's like, okay, let's get on with the other things that we can get on with. I think lots of organisations build it into a whole lot of their internal models, and it is a fair enough question, and I look forward to the day when it might be able to be talked about, I guess, and for it to be politically palatable again.
Yeah.